Great. Well, I wanted to start out by first thanking the World Affairs Council of Connecticut for hosting us and setting this whole thing up, as well as Megan mentioned, the many amazing sponsors that allow this to happen. General Thomas, Dr. Engel, thank you both for being here and for allowing me this opportunity to ask you some questions. I'm really looking forward to learning from you, and I'm humbled by this opportunity. So looking forward to your answers to my questions, as well as the audience will have time for audience questions after we get a couple up here on stage. So should we get started?
Yeah.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, General Thomas, I'll start with you. It's kind of a big ask, but in order to help us understand how we got to the current situation and age of instability in the South China Sea around Taiwan, could you please just touch on the history and the buildup to the current geostrategic situation, and specifically what the U.S. has done or said during the course of that history?
So he wants me to do like 3,000 years of history in about 3 minutes. It's good to get the softballs out of the way at the beginning. So I'll try to be as brief as possible, really cover the last 300 or so, and most of it focus on the last 50 years, because that's the most relevant for the discussion. But probably, this island that we're talking about used to be called Formosa. Modern history, Dutch showed up in the 1600s, little trading post. Spanish showed up, Dutch kicked them off the island. Then the Qing Emperor in mainland China said, hey, what are you all doing? Get out of there. So that's the real, first time that, a Chinese empire said they've got claim to this island that was called Formosa at the time. Fast forward to 1895. There's a little dust up between the Emperor of China and China itself and Japan, Treaty of Shimonoseki. They cede the island of Formosa to Japan. So now Japan becomes a player, a claimant, so to speak, to the island. Next big step, 1912. So big event in Chinese history. The Qing Emperor abdicates. There's the start of a Republic of China, nationalist Sun Yat-sen and all that. Turns into a civil war eventually in the 1920s, interrupted by the Second World War, 1945. Japan loses. They evacuate the island of Formosa, and it becomes part of China again. 1949, next big event, because that really sets the stage for the discussion that we're having here. Resolution, at least at that point, of the Chinese Civil War. The nationalists leave the mainland. 1.2 million Chinese follow Chiang Kai-shek to Formosa, and they establish the Republic of China there. So that kind of gets to the point of now you have two sides, so to speak, set up across this 100 nautical miles of water we now call the Taiwan Strait. The U.S. role in all of this has generally been supportive of the Republic of China and the nationalist Chinese, and it goes all the way through 1971. There's this time period between 1949 and 1971 where there's a mutual defense treaty between the United States and the Republic of China. There are U.S. armed forces that are stationed on the island, very deep and significant relationship. Then in 1972, President Nixon and Kissinger say, hey, there's an opportunity. We can maybe drive a wedge in between the Soviet Union and the PRC, and so they basically do a diplomatic opening, and I think everybody's familiar with that. The significance there in terms of U.S. policy is there's a series of communiques in 1972, 1978, 1982, and those are agreements between the U.S. and the PRC about how we're going to conduct what we now have our diplomatic ties. It includes in 1979 a formal change of diplomatic recognition of the United States, of the government of China to the People's Republic of China versus the Republic of China. So those three communiques are important. The second of what are really three fundamental pillars of the current U.S. One China policy is the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act. So that, as much as anything else, is a reaction to the 1979 communique and the decision to change recognition of the government to the PRC. Basically, it says that changed, but a lot isn't changed or can't change. So we're going to continue to support the Republic of China. We won't have an embassy, but we'll have this thing called the American Institute of Taiwan, which acts a lot like the embassy, and the Republic of China will have something similar in Washington, D.C. And so that Taiwan Relations Act, particularly important because it limits the bounds also of how far the administration can move, any given administration, off of the center line, so to speak, of this one China policy. And the last one, and it's this third pillar, was only recently revealed. It was classified before. It's called the 6 assurances. So if you're not familiar with that, those were 6 assurances that were issued to the Republic of China government in 1982 following that communique. And it was particularly important because that communique with the PRC was about arms sales. One of the subjects was about arms sales to the Republic of China. And it appeared that the United States was willing to limit and eventually dial down arms transfers to the Republic of China. The 6 assurances, several of them were associated with, but under only certain conditions. And as you can see today, those conditions really haven't been met, and we continue to support them with arms sales. So those 3 pillars are particularly important, and if we want to get deeper into it, we can. But the last thing that I'll mention is that that core of the one China policy, since then there's been some significant events, and they're worth noting. In particular, I would point out, one, the democratic transition that's occurred in Taiwan itself. The Republic of China was under martial law all the way until 1987. I mean, this was, remember the history there, they were kicked out and they were still engaged in a civil war, and they were still active fighting for a good portion of that, certainly during the 50s and 60s. But they transitioned democratically, and in 2000, the first presidential election, if I recall, was 1996. 2000, there was a peaceful transfer between the Kuomintang Party, the KMT, and the Democratic People's Party. That should be significant for us because that's never happened in mainland China. If you just kind of walk through the dynastic transitions and then the transitions even within the Chinese Communist Party from one to the other, as Mao Zedong transitioned, a lot of violence, a lot of blood. Since then, there's been, I think, 3 back and forths between the KMT and the DPP. The point there is that an actual, real, vibrant democracy exists on the island of Taiwan. So that's point 1. Point 2, what happened in Hong Kong in 2020 is notable. If you didn't recognize it as a death of one country and 2 systems model that the PRC has articulated, I would say that it was, and it's mattered in Taiwan. And then the third, we can't, in the background of all of this, 1991 and the fall of the Soviet Union, that is a factor, and that bears on the minds of the Chinese Communist Party leadership and their behavior on this particular issue related to the Straits. Just the last thing to summarize, I didn't really mention it. The U.S. policy, particularly on the Taiwan issue, the one China policy, says that the U.S. doesn't take a position on the resolution of that dispute. The U.S. says that the parties involved need to resolve it themselves, but it needs to be done peacefully, not with the use of force, and that it is a strategic interest of the United States on how that issue is resolved. So that's where there's some strategic ambiguity there, intentional on the part of the U.S., but the U.S. has never clearly stated one way or the other because we don't believe it's in our interest to state it, where we fall on that issue. Hopefully
Perfect.
That covers it.
Thank you so much. I think you did a great job with consolidating that history as much as possible.
Thanks.
One more question for you, and then we'll ask Dr. Engel to help us understand the economic implications. This Taiwan question is one of vital national importance to China, to the People's Republic of China. To quote President Xi Jinping himself, he said, "Resolving the Taiwan question and realizing China's complete reunification is a historic mission and an unshakable commitment of the Communist Party of China." So why exactly, you touched on Taiwan itself and the U.S., why is this such an important issue for the People's Republic of China, and what's their end goal in this situation?
I'll answer the last one first. The end goal is that the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping is their leader, they believe Taiwan needs to be part of the PRC and they need to be in control of it. It is subject to the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, and there's really no lesser situation that's going to be acceptable. Why? Why do they feel that way? First of all, I'll go back to the point that there was a civil war. It's still technically underway. I mean, there was no armistice that was signed like we have on the Korean Peninsula, because that war's not quite done either. But these are 2 sides that still claim each other's territory. So in a way, resolving that is finishing the work of these great Chinese leaders in Xi Jinping's mind, that he's continuing that work. So that's point 1. Point 2 is, I would argue that Taiwan, and now as a thriving democracy, represents a threat to the Chinese Communist Party. Because what it is it is a Society very similar in terms of culture and heritage to the mainland society, and yet somehow they have figured out to do peaceful transitions of authority within their government. They have figured out how to have a very thriving economy without having centralized state control. It is an entirely different model, and despite the fact that there's been economic success in the PRC, you could challenge whether they've seen the same types of success in other parts of the society. And the third is that just now taking it from kind of an operational military and maybe economic frame of mind, that is key strategic terrain. So if you are the People's Republic of China and you believe that this is your age and you have to be able to, as a minimum, control your geography and maybe even project even further, you are severely limited by the presence of Taiwan. It forces you to channel your movements to the Miyako and the Luzon Straits. It constrains your Navy. It constrains your Air Force. It allows others to get in close to you. You know, the transit through the Taiwan Straits is used often to include by the United States of America to make a point. And so just the geostrategic maneuver space that's created by turning Taiwan into a place that they can control is particularly important. We shouldn't make any mistake about it. I mean, this is a fundamental issue to the PRC and particularly the Chinese Communist Party. And if this ever gets into a fight and it turns into a stalemate, we'll need to really think through how that plays out, because there could be acts of desperation that occur. Hopefully it never comes to that.
Yeah, perfect, thank you. And like I said, there's a lot more to unpack, and we'll get to more of the military aspect later, but I don't want to leave out Dr. Engel to understand some of these economic implications and economic factors at play. So could you just help us understand, with the potential for conflict in Taiwan, what are those economic implications for the global economy at large, as well as for the U.S. and China as actors in this drama?
Sure. So might help just to have a little bit of the idea of Taiwan's sort of economic geography in your head. So if you have the island in, kind of just to visualize the island, most of the economic activity and most of the population is actually on the west, so closer to the Chinese mainland. The largest port in Taiwan is Kaohsiung. I'm not sure I'm saying that right. About the 15th largest port in the world. Hundreds of ships, container ships with different kinds of goods are transiting the Taiwan Strait every day. So for example, in early August, when the Chinese announced these exercises because they were concerned about Pelosi's visit, they basically shut down a ton of traffic in and around Taiwan. So they had those 6 blocks that they actually kind of identified, and ships were sort of moving in and around, had to reroute. It's a pain. It adds a couple days of transit. It's not insurmountable, but it is something that is very disruptive. So just the general sort of trade flows in and around the island are pretty intense, and there's quite a lot of connections between Taiwan, the mainland, and supply chains across Asia. There's about a couple hundred flights that are going in and out of Taiwan every day, so those were also severely disrupted. So we had like a little glimpse during those Chinese exercises in early August of kind of the amount of disruption we might see in and around the airspace and some of the naval space, commercial spaces. So we did see some of it. It was definitely very disruptive, but I think, a couple days of rerouting, I think people were like, okay, maybe we could manage that. But if you're really thinking about Taiwan being shut down, so the economy of Taiwan is about the size of New Jersey. I say that because I'm from New Jersey, so I had to throw that in. About $700 billion in GDP annually. Its first largest trade partner is China. About 25% of total trade is with China. If you add Hong Kong to that, then it's about another 8 or 9%. So it's a pretty big chunk of their trade is with mainland China. The second largest trade partner for Taiwan is the United States at about 13%, so half-ish of mainland China. So you can see the dilemma in here, which is the Taiwanese, if there's a serious disruption or a serious shutdown of Taiwan and Taiwan's economy, China itself will be deeply affected. And this has always been kind of a concern and sort of trying to understand the calculus that the Chinese might bring to this problem is really difficult because they are extremely intertwined with each other. And most projections suggest that in the very near term, China would be hurting itself economically more than anyone else with any kind of major disruption or shutdown of Taiwanese assets. However, over the longer term, if they're able to absorb some of Taiwan's expertise, some of Taiwan's industry, and also build up more of their domestic industries, particularly in semiconductors, which is a big area, they may actually be able to mitigate some of the costs of that initial invasion or initial takeover of Taiwan's economy. So those are some considerations. And I would just say, you know, from an economic standpoint, we were talking about this a little bit before, you know, short of war, economics, statecraft, which is kind of the term that's used a lot in Washington these days, sanctions, tech transfer policies or restrictions, restrictions in finance, restrictions on trade, restrictions on movement of people, all of these other tools in our toolkit are getting a lot of attention. And there's a lot of interest in kind of building up more strategic playbook in terms of how we approach the ability to coerce, co-opt, constrain, deter adversaries through economic means. And so I think we'll probably get into that a little bit, but the Russia case is a good one to probably talk about a little bit, but I'll just end there.
Well, I wanted to touch on the Russia-Ukraine situation because I feel like a question that a lot of people have is how does this compare economically? You know, we've seen how the West has dealt with and tried to manage the Russia-Ukraine situation and punish Russia for the invasion. Mm-hmm. How does this potential for conflict over Taiwan compare to that? And given the size and intertwinedness, I guess, of the Chinese and Taiwanese economy, how is it similar and how is it different from an economic standpoint and those levers that we could use to deter China?
Yeah, so let me step back for a second before I answer that question. So I just want to talk a little bit about sanctions because I think they get thrown around a lot and I'm not sure people completely conceptually understand what they are about. So sanctions are an economic tool to achieve a political end, right? So they're not just an economic, you know, we're not doing sanctions to achieve economic ends in of themselves, we're trying to achieve political ends. The definition of those political ends is actually, I think, the hardest part of using sanctions. So I think you kind of have to define the end state a little bit. You know, you have to think about what you're trying to accomplish. So in the Russia case, I think in 2014, which was a little bit of an interesting run-up to what we're dealing with today, the incursions by Russia were much more muted, a lot more sort of plausible deniability. It wasn't full-on, columns of tanks. It was definitely a little bit of a surprise, and it was something that the U.S. and partners were not quite ready for. So what we did in terms of sanctions was smaller, incremental, not terribly effective probably, but maybe deterred a little bit, constrained a little bit once they began to bite. This time around, 2022, they've been much more comprehensive, much bigger. So we have done much larger sets of sanctions on all kinds of financial assets, lots of different players. I think we have more than 1,000 Russian entities now on our sanctions lists. So there's a much bigger set of players now that have been caught up in the sanctions programs of the United States. We've also gone into kind of what we call like sort of higher end economic, I don't want to call it warfare, but economic conflict, which is we've de-SWIFTed a number of Russian banks, meaning we have to deny them access to the SWIFT messaging network, which is about 10,000 financial institutions around the world. It was a big step. We have gone after a couple strategic sectors, so we've done some stuff on the energy sector, denying them technologies that they need to develop and repair big parts of their energy sector. So we think that's probably not a near-term pain point, but a long-term. So the degradation over time of Russia's ability to fund their military operations out of their energy sector is something that we've been focused on. And I think the same things will apply in a Taiwan conflict. So we will see efforts to create kind of an escalation plan where we will target and message around different kinds of issues. The sanctions packages are always sort of tailored to tell a story around that particular conflict. So it will depend on the character of the conflict. But we'll have a whole set of issues or policies that we will tee up from, mild to much more significant. We'll be signaling that. They'll be signaling back. And I think the issue with China will be that they will probably hit back in ways that are a lot more significant than the Russians have been able to do. So the ability of the Chinese to sanction us, to hit us where it might hurt, to deny access from US companies, to expropriate, much bigger, more significant. There's something like $31 billion of US investment in Taiwan itself. And then there's billions and billions more in mainland China. So I think it really will depend on the character of the conflict.
Perfect. And like you said, just the sheer size of China's economy as well as the dependence of China and the U.S. on Taiwan's economy makes it, I think, a far more complex issue than what's currently going on in Russia and Ukraine. So really appreciate those insights. Shifting back to more of a military perspective, General Thomas, speaking on the strengths and weaknesses of the People's Liberation Army of China, if they were to attempt to use force to settle this Taiwan question, what do you see as those strengths and weaknesses that China has in their PLA to resolve this question?
Okay. I think before talking a little bit about the actual PLA and its components itself, it's important to think through what is the military problem that they have. And I think, I see lots of soldiers in the audience, so I think you'd agree with me, at least I understand. One of the most difficult things to do is to do a river crossing that's contested. In terms of the operational level planning that has to be done, the actual complexity of the maneuver itself, the fact that you're going to be under fire while you're doing it. Well, this is a 100 nautical mile river crossing that we're talking about. And we're talking about to get the combat power on the island that will actually make a difference, it's tens of thousands of PLA Marines and PLA airborne forces. So can they do that or not, I think is fundamentally your question. They've got some real advantages and strengths that they've developed over the years. They have an overmatch in surface-to-surface fires, and air-to-surface, quite frankly, that especially inside 1,500 nautical miles is going to make it really, really hard for the Taiwanese to defend themselves, as well as others like us, potentially, to come to their aid. At the same time, they have some limitations. They don't have a very strong bomber force, and so their ability to launch air-to-surface fires is challenged a bit. They've got a really strong Navy in many aspects. Their surface combatants, particularly the Renhai cruiser and the Luoyang 3 destroyer, very, very good. They're not very good at undersea warfare. They've got a lot of deficiencies there, so that's important. They've got good game, so to speak, just use that broad term in the space domain. I'm sure you've heard a lot about that, as well as in the cyber domain. They're really weak, though, in terms of amphibious movement and the ability to get the mass of men and materials, so to speak, across that 100 nautical miles. And when they do it, they're going to have to do it in at least 2 echelons, and that creates a vulnerability. That time gap in between echelon 1 and echelon 2 is an opportunity for anybody who's going to oppose that crossing. So it's, I would say the answer is their capabilities are uneven. They're actually really good in some areas. They have a lot of work to do. The last thing I'll close with is they do not have real deep experience in joint warfare. So if you try to take the US military and mirror image on top of the PLA, I think we're going to miss some really key and important distinctions. We made a lot of progress since the 80s in the Goldwater-Nichols Act. The other part is the Taiwanese military has not, but if the US military gets involved, we're seasoned in combat. Not this kind of combat. This is going to be a different beast, but there's a level of experience that our leadership and our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen have that the PLA does not.
Fantastic. And that was going to be my follow-up question is, given your experience as the former Deputy Commander of Pacific Air Forces and given Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's announcement in 2011 of kind of our shift and our pivot to Asia and to the Pacific in preparation for this type of conflict if it were to break out, How do you assess the preparedness of U.S. forces for a conflict like this? And do you think we've been successful in managing a military pivot to the Pacific, specifically Taiwan region?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's revealing about the world, the age of instability, the subject of our conference here. So the Obama administration, Secretary Clinton, as you mentioned, and others, I mean, even as recent as the Trump administration and then this Biden administration, they've all said China and the Indo-Pacific, that's the priority, and China is the biggest threat. And so we're going to realign resources, and we're going to have this thing even called the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, which is basically, intended to mirror what was done in Europe when, after the Russians invaded Crimea in 2014 in eastern Ukraine. The reality of it on the ground has been far different. And I think the reason why is there's so many other pressing things that have come up in those intervening time periods. We would like to get out of the Middle East. We would maybe like to forget a little bit about the Middle East. I don't think the Middle East has forgotten about us at all. And whether you look at Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, it's occupied the attention and thus the resources of the U.S. government, and to the extent that it pulls allies and partners in, same there. Now, there'll be a full talk. You mentioned Ukraine several different times, but Europe and instability there has kept a focus. I mean, there's literally, I have friends, colleagues who I keep in touch with out in the Indo-Pacific, and one of the challenges that they've got right now is resources needing to be diverted to support a very important and significant commitment that we've got in Europe. So as much as we would like to see it transition, I'm not sure that the facts on the ground support the positions that we've been articulating.
Interesting. And as it was mentioned last night, we don't have that privilege of just prioritizing, ordering, and saying, okay, this is number one, this has all our attention. We have so many different commitments that take our attention away from that. And I think it's interesting to note that if you look at China, at the PRC and the PLA, they've had, during their time of kind of rejuvenation and reinvigorating their country and their economy, they've been looking at us, and they've been looking at this Taiwan question. And so while our attention has been diverted other places, China and their army has been focused on really this issue because it's of so much importance to them. So I think that's fascinating, and that'll be an interesting factor if conflict were to break out.
Yeah, great.
All right, so we want to get to audience questions. I have one more for Dr. Engel, and then we will open it to the audience. So have those questions ready if you have any. But Dr. Engel, talking of the U.S. kind of shift to the Pacific region and what we're trying to do militarily to be ready for such a conflict, what is the U.S. currently doing, or what can the U.S. do, in your opinion, to shape this environment economically to either deter China from a forceful invasion of Taiwan or be able to manage that conflict? So, what is the U.S. doing to shape that environment?
Right, so a couple things. One, we're working a little bit to sort of strengthen domestic resilience, right? So you've seen a lot of this out of the Biden administration. I would point to maybe the CHIPS Act, CHIPS and Science Act. So an effort to ensure that we have sufficient domestic capability and capacity to build semiconductors, as well as some other key aspects of U.S. supply chain and address key aspects of U.S. supply chain risk. So, I mean, one of the first things that the Biden administration put out was sort of I can't remember, it was like a 100-day review of U.S. supply chain. That has actually kind of created a bunch of different initiatives across a number of strategic industries, with chips being kind of the most prominent of them. So I would say, one, we're taking a hard look at the places, and COVID's been, in a way, kind of useful in helping us see where those vulnerabilities are. So I think there is some effort and some interest and some serious money now going into the sort of supply chain, domestic resilience, industrial policy kind of set of issues that you're seeing. So that's one. Two, I think you're seeing more U.S. engagement globally on a couple of areas that I think they see as very important. One, there's been a stand-up of the Trade and Technology Council. So there's sort of an effort to, I would say, salvage a couple of key kind of trade and investment relationships that went a little sour from 2017 to 2020. So We have the Trade and Technology Council, which is being set up with Europe. So it's kind of an outgrowth of what they called the TTIP, which was the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. But it's a little bit more focused now on investments in technology. So there's this kind of tech competition arena as we're trying to kind of work together with transatlantic partners to set the standards in technology. So this is definitely an effort to compete with China, ensure that the transatlantic partners are strong and able to support each other in critical technologies that might be difficult to develop if we have some disruptions in Asia. Third, I would say the Indo-Pacific economic framework. So we are heavily engaged now in the Indo-Pacific, and this is again a little bit of an effort to pick up the TPP and re-engage the United States in Indo-Pacific and the TPP. It ended up being the CPTPP, so a bunch of people went on without us. And the United States is now in an effort to kind of like rebind ourselves economically with a number of those partners. So that's another effort. So working again with allies. And then I would say refining our toolkit. And I would say the Russia case has been really helpful in this, in that we have needed to work together across different agencies in the US government to bring together all the different tools, non-military for the most part, that we can use to put pressure on Russia to help Ukraine. So I think it's all of those that we're using to try to shape this environment so that we can act effectively if something comes up in Taiwan.
Fascinating. A lot of that is well above my pay grade. I don't understand a ton of that, but I appreciate you. I appreciate you answering that question. Well, I have plenty more questions that I would love to ask you both, but we're going to open it up to the audience now. So I think we have some helpers in the audience with microphones. So if you could just raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll find you with a microphone. We've got our first one right here.
Hi, my name's Nick Cato. I'm the paparazzi for the event, but also a longtime student of foreign relations, international affairs. This past Sunday, in a pre-recorded interview on 60 Minutes, President Biden, for what wound up being the fourth time, declared that the United States would come to the aid of Taiwan if they were attacked militarily by China. Is this the end of the one China policy, a step towards that? And then also, how would China react to these statements economically and militarily? Thank you.
Yes, I'll
Thomas, you
start.
want to take that one?
So, I mean, you point out a notable development. This is, we've not had a U.S. president say such things, and certainly the number of times that he said it suggests that it's more than just a gaffe, so to speak. And because the first few times, if you're not familiar, there were attempts to kind of walk it back and go, wait a minute, this is how it fits into the U.S. one China policy. There's been a debate that I've sensed and listened to and participated a little bit in, whether it's the right thing to provide more clarity in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship and how that reflects upon the PRC and maybe how it changes their behavior. This is probably part of that. Key things, though, a couple of them. One is that that's not written down. All the fundamental core, the three tenets of the U.S. one China policy is all written down. So it's extant, and it's something that a follow-on administration has to respond to and actually change if you truly want to change the policy. Second is probably as important, and this was Cadet Thatcher actually reminded me of it. It's a very good point. The recent visits by Speaker Pelosi also talked about, well, we support the ability of the people of Taiwan to decide their own fate, whether to be independent or not. That is also a pretty significant policy deviation in the sense that the U.S. has always said, and it was a clarification made in the 80s, that any changes to the status of Taiwan require the assent of the Taiwanese people, meaning that the ROC government itself couldn't break a deal or broker a deal with the Chinese Communist Party and kind of leave the people of Taiwan out. We said they need to have a, so to speak, vote in it. So that would be a major policy change as well. But again, not written down. We'll have to see how this plays out. And if it truly becomes U.S. policy, you'll see them put it down in writing.
I don't think I have a whole lot to add on the economics. I would just say during the Chinese military exercises in August, and then Speaker Pelosi's visit, the most that the Chinese did economically there was to put some sanctions on a couple Taiwanese goods. But it was really minor. And this is just an effort, I think, to minimize the cost at home. So they have a lot to balance in terms of what they do economically with Taiwan. So I think it ended up being like 0.4% of the total value of China-Taiwan trade. So highly symbolic stuff. And I think in the economic sphere, it'll probably stay that way until there's serious stuff going on.
Great. Thank you for that question. Obviously, age of instability, right? There's developments even within the last week, and that was certainly one of those, so I appreciate that. I think we have time for one more question. Whoever has a mic over here.
Hi, Cadet First Class Story from the Air Force Academy. Just wanted to pose the question. We've seen with this conflict in Ukraine that there's a massive international effort to really aid Ukraine. How do we assess the capabilities of our partners and allies to respond to the Taiwan question? Like, does China constitute such an economic and military power that we may be forced to go it alone?
Sure. So I do think it's interesting, and we've certainly been watching the fact that sign-on for the sanctions against Russia has been incomplete, to say the least. So the Europeans have been obviously very on board, but their security interests are extremely central to this conflict. But there have been many other countries that have not gone along. And that's probably a little bit heartening. And the Chinese relationship, economic relationships with other countries is so significant, that's going to be difficult to build a serious coalition for very major sanctions. Initially, maybe there might be some movements, some strategies we could use over time. But you're right to point out that the ability to pull together very effective economic sanctions coalitions against China will be difficult, which is, I think the Chinese will know, and they will choose their tactics accordingly. So that's, I think, all I can say.
Okay. In terms of third parties, I'd use that. I guess we're a third party in this Taiwan Straits issue, but maybe fourth parties. But I would say there was a time when the tide was kind of moving in the direction of, hey, we really would choose not to get involved in that. And it was a time period where, economic prosperity in China, global linkages, attempts to, share all that was occurring in probably the first 10 to 15 years of this decade. I think that all changed about 2015 or so. Chinese behavior in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, even along the Indian border, started to expose, hey, maybe they're not quite as good as they want to be or assert they are going to be for us in our relationship. And so recently now, moved to just even the past couple of years, statements that come out of the government of Japan that they never made before about the significance of of Taiwan itself to their national security. So that doesn't mean that they've said, hey, we're going to get involved if there's an armed conflict and the PRC seeks to seize Taiwan by force, but it certainly is movement in that direction. South Korea, another important player, not quite that kind of movement, but in a joint communique just recently within the last year, Taiwan was actually mentioned, which they'd never done before. Australia, I think, is a really important case, and it has an economic aspect to it as well. So the behavior of the PRC in attempting to effectively punish Australia for a position that they'd taken related to, kind of geostrategic issues, and I can't remember the specific proximate cause, but has really turned Australia against the PRC. In a land that there was at one time some sentiment and, kind of like, hey, let's have a good relationship with the People's Republic of China. And so all of those things suggest to me that they are likely to be helpful to Taiwan and the United States if we choose to get involved. The degree to which they're going to be helpful is very much going to be a function of their own unique circumstances and how they perceive their national security interests. But I think the tide is moving in a direction supportive of Taiwan and its own national security needs.
Fantastic. Well, we are out of time. This is a topic I could keep talking about for a long time, but we want to get to the fantastic panels that we have later on in the day. So once again, thank you both for being here and answering our questions and just sharing some of the knowledge that you have on this issue with us. And we look forward to the panels the rest of the day.
Thank you.